stuff that does affect SIG architecture, I think it does. I'm not quite certain. It might. Is this is a weird space? Is that when we recharter things, does SIG architecture to help define like the charters of what is a SIG and what is not a SIG, and who owns what code? Is that
Definitely
ours?
the project sub-project ownership is sort of in our wheelhouse. And to some degree, we may be a consultant on what code belongs where. I think the idea is simply that SIGs claim it. And then if there's somebody's trying to stake a claim on code that they think is actually belongs to another SIG, then they have to untangle that.
Okay. Because I think like as we start to break down, what rechartering for the SIG and what are sub-projects within the SIG, I'm sure we're probably going to have some level of distillation and reduce some of the SIG sprawl we have and try to like coalesce them underneath one banner and with many sub-projects.
Yeah.
And I think we're already seeing that with the like I think SIG scale. I think one of the things that Bob was floating the idea of folding that into as a working or as a sub-project for or working group under testing.
Yeah, that was the original thing I proposed, but people pushed back. That was a long time ago, but I think that would be a good idea.
I think it might be a different thing now. And then there's the sprawl around all the cloud provider stuff there, and I think some of that is so there's this cap on sort of breaking out the cloud providers, and there's a PR in flight right now from Caleb that starts specifying a whole bunch of new repos for the individual cloud providers, and I think that sort of begs the question of like, okay, well, who owns those? And there are things like, I don't know, the overt cloud provider that like, I don't know who the heck's going to own that, right? Because like we don't have a SIG that's going to sign up to own that piece of code.
I kind of wondered as part of the breakout, if we don't simply just make SIG cloud and put all the providers as working groups underneath.
I think that's a sane way to go. I think that, there's just making that happen. You have to have somebody step up and sort of pull people together and start to form the nucleus of that particular SIG.
That'll probably be me at some point, but
well,
anytime soon.
I was debating whether or not we wanted to have like a forcing function. I was going to talk about this in the next steering committee, and I think it percolates back to this. It was like we need to have the SIGs have like an updated charter, like at some point in time, and that charter would be like the forcing function to be like, okay, we should coalesce and reconvene and redefine what that charter is. But the question is like, who approves said charter? Is that SIG Arch?
No, I think it's got to be the steering committee in consultation with SIG Architecture. So I would say that it's the steering committee. This is my sort of opinion. It'd be the steering committee for sort of the governance parts of the charter. But in terms of how do we actually sort of break up the project and assign, code to areas, I think SIG Architecture consulting on that makes a ton of sense.
Yeah, I just want to make sure that we prevent the errors of the past and try to coalesce and do things in a rational environment now, because we have so many SIGs, and some of those SIGs are not even attended right as much as they used to be. I know there was a whiz bang in the beginning, but then it kind of dissipated, and the question of what are they maintaining and owning has always been there too. So I think distilling that down so that way it's rationalized and people can have a way to figure out what's actively being worked on and maintained and who owns what would help.
Well, I think, one of the reasons why, in my opinion, we got into the mess that we're in now was because there was nobody to definitively say no or yes on things. And so what would happen is, and you'll see this if you look at sort of how some of these SIGs were formed, it was like, hey, I want to do SIG XYZ, and then they send mail to Kubernetes dev, and then it's crickets, and then somebody with wide-ranging commit powers just sort of makes it happen, right? So there's no like, it was all based on sort of people and convincing a certain person, and sometimes this stuff would all happen sort of, out of sight of sort of the larger community. So I feel like we've at least moved past that now. But there is that sort of go up and, go back and try and clean stuff up.
Yeah. You know, it's interesting. Before the steering committee was formed, I was actually working on a governance model that I was going to socialize, but the steering committee happened and kind of obviated some of it. But essentially, the model that I had was a series of committees that are the sort of munged together aspects, like architecture was one of them, but then there's also like program management. So that includes things like testing, documentation, et cetera. And then these committees would essentially have power to create and destroy SIGs that are under their auspices. So essentially, if like, for example, the program management committee says, SIG PM is not cutting it anymore, it's lowly attended, it needs to be disbanded, then they would have that power. And I'm wondering, like, if there's not some way to maybe call out some of the bits and pieces of this governance model to look and see if it might be relevant to have some sort of cogent way of creating and disbanding SIGs, or making sure that they're actually meeting their charter. Because I don't feel like the steering committee is the right group for that. I feel like that's a little bit like one level too low in the details.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think the idea was to find sort of groups under the steering committee and delegate, powers and decision making there. I think the goal from the get-go was not to have the steering committee in the thick of every discussion and decision. That was explicitly something that we didn't want to do. One of the things that I think we haven't done a good job of is really, driven home the nomenclature between, committee, SIG, and working group. And so, just that's a little bit of an aside from this. But in my mind, committee, we shouldn't have that many committees, because committees have, defined membership and closed door meetings, and there's a privacy sort of like, okay, we have to talk in. There's sort of, I mean, there's a clickiness to committee that I don't think is something that we want to have a lot of. Whereas SIGs are much more open and community driven versus this sort of closed set of decision makers.
Yeah, I agree. I'm going to paste this thing that I did ages ago in here in the chat if you want to look at it or not. I mean, this was long before there was a steering committee. So I was trying to address like,
yeah.
But there's just a lot of brain vomit.
No, it's not. I mean, it's not too far off from where we're at. I think one of the things that we've done is, and I'm not sure if you have. Okay, so you do talk about sort of like consensus. I mean, this idea of modified lazy consensus for decision making, because like probably 95% of the decisions that we make in Kubernetes are not contentious, right? It's just a matter of getting attention and getting eyes on stuff, like getting this PR merged that we talked about earlier, right? The 1813, the community repo. It's like, it's not like this is a controversial thing. It's just getting eyes on stuff. So yeah.
100%. So I think that, this is probably the next wild frontier of things that we're going to have to conquer, because I do believe at this point, SIG, sprawl, and what is the right word that I want to use there? It's a dis word. There's too much granularity in ownership. Like there's areas where I feel like things are just not being looked at because it's so dispersed. That's the word.
Well, and I think, as we start to try and align code to people structures, we are going to find that, hey, we have code that nobody owns, and that'll actually force us to think about what is the right SIG to own this, and does that SIG exist, or is it sort of a generalization of a bunch of stuff we already have? So I think those are definitely useful discussions to have.
Agreed. All right. Well, I think we've wandered so far off the architecture map. We should probably just adjourn, but I think these are fantastic discussions, and I think that we should try and continue to find forums for these, because frankly, this is what's going to keep this project healthy if we can keep a good rein on governance. So.
I had a quick question if everyone has a minute or two left. And it's kind of related to the document you wrote, Jace, about contributors. And it's a theme I've seen emerge in quite a few other places, where there is an opinion that non-technical, non-code contributions are as valuable, or in some cases more valuable, than technical and code contributions. And I personally kind of disagree with that point of view, but I'm curious what other people's perceptions of that are.
I disagree with your disagreement. Well,
that's exactly what I'm looking for, is to understand what people's thinking is on the matter.
The management and overhead of having a release is of trying to coalesce what is inside of a release is a non-trivial amount of work, and to make it sane and rationalize the order of execution. That none of that is quote unquote technical. It's almost like project management.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's super invaluable for the community, because it allows them to focus on execution priorities. And
yeah. So I don't disagree with that. And I guess in my mind, the things that I think are valuable are the concrete mechanisms by which we produce good code and release it out into the wild in a stable form. So that is, writing the code, testing the code, releasing the code, those kind of things, which I think are somewhat distinct from, I would characterize them as the more sort of social stuff, which is, stuff that doesn't involve actually getting code out the door.
So I think the right way to maybe, and I responded to the to your comment on the doc, Quinn. Mm-hmm. In my mind, the right way to think about this is that, ambassadors or advocates, those are outward facing, right? Those are people who are helping with the larger community. I don't think that's a Kubernetes contributor, right? That's somebody who's helping to boost the Kubernetes, world. So they're a booster or an ambassador, but they're not actually helping to move the project forward, in terms of making the project better intrinsically. And when I look at this, I think, like we hired George, right? So George is not writing code, but I think he's definitely a contributor, because he's really helping to sort of organize and make stuff happen and drive meetings, and he's sort of lubricating the community process, him and Paris and a set of other folks. But then I also hired Chris Nova. Now she also writes code and does stuff like that, but a bulk of her activities is going out and talking to the larger community, and so it's an outward facing role. I wouldn't say that part of her job would qualify her as being a contributor. I think she does other stuff that qualifies, but not that.
And to be clear, I'm not actually disputing that we have different kinds of contributors and that they're all necessary. So I think that is very clear, and I think they should all get recognition for the contributions they make, even if they're ambassadors and they're writing blog posts or hosting meetups or whatever that might involve. My question is more around, I guess, to put it simply, and then maybe this is not the right place for the discussion, but I'll finish it off now. So I think if we had none of any of those things, and we just had a small group of people writing code, as I think it was largely the case in the early days of Kubernetes, and something went out there and people used it, we would still have a Kubernetes. I think if we just had all the other stuff other than writing code and testing it and releasing it, we wouldn't have a Kubernetes. And I guess the question is, does that mean that one is more important than the other, or does it not? And I don't know the answer. I guess I'm just soliciting people's opinions to figure out whether there's anyone else who thinks similarly, or whether I'm a crazy person.
I think that there's two sides of the coin. You see this reflected in any large software organization. You have product and you have code, right? If you just have people writing code without some sort of guardrails, it just goes squirrely fast or turns into horrible, legacy monoliths and all sorts of things. So, and in fact, the early part of the code, you can see that was really true. There was a lot of get it out the door code that didn't have any guidance from any of the other critical aspects of leadership. So I believe that it's really it's a partnership between the functional and non-functional requirements, and that those balance one another out in a healthy way. And yes, actually, if everybody stopped writing code right now, we would still have a Kubernetes. And If everybody disappeared off the project, as far as that wasn't contributing code, yes, we would have a continual version of Kubernetes with unknown level of stability or sanity or et cetera, et cetera. So those things, in my mind, one does not obviate the other. There's a strong partnership there that has proven time and again to be valuable in every software organization I've worked at. So what I think muddies the waters is where you have people who are sort of doing neither, and those sort of edge fringe roles are a little more complicated to assess what the value is to the ecosystem. And I think that's maybe the more important thing, and that's why I put the third leg in of community contributors, because that's somebody that shows up. That's at the bottom of the line. That's somebody who shows up, attends meetings, does things. Maybe they report an issue and every now and then, but they're not actively working for the betterment of the ecosystem. They're just participating.
So just to put some concrete meat on this, the reason why this matters is that the folks that we consider to be contributors of some stripe will ultimately have a say in the governance of the project, whether that be electing the steering committee or within a particular SIG helping to make decisions within that SIG when things get contentious. So I think that's why this stuff matters. And I think it's to some degree, this is going to have to be in the hands of the SIGs themselves. Like if somebody is actively contributing to the SIG, it's going to be up to the SIG to actually know that. I don't think that our current process of having people send email to a list saying, hey, I'm want to be, a member, add me to the GitHub membership. I don't think we want to keep that centralized long term. At least that's my feeling on this. The counter argument here is that we don't want people to sort of, throw bodies at the community and sort of, and have them show up to the point of being able to distort the governance process, because there is this idea of like, and I am with Quentin to some degree, like not everybody is contributing at the same level, yet, any sort of like, hey, proportional votes based on your level of contribution is just insane. So we have to have some sort of cutoff at some point to in terms of whose contributions, what level of contribution is good enough for somebody to actually start having a say in our governance.
Yeah, just to be clear, my question was not so much who gets a vote and who gets to be considered a contributor or not. My question was more around, do we as a project feel like we need more effective technical contribution at this point? And by technical, I mean actual, like real PRs in some form or another. Or do we feel like we need more of the non-code, non-technical contribution? My sense is we need more of the former and less of the latter, and we need to incentivize that. But if I'm wrong, if everyone else thinks that's not the case, then
so I say we do need more people writing code, but right now our current structures are not set up to actually scale to that level. I think our ad hoc, one-on-one, self-organizing structures are at their breaking point with respect to people being effective in terms of writing quality software. And so for us to actually have more people writing code, we do need more organization, more structure, more communication paths, more. That's why I'm spending time on stuff like the KEP stuff, right? Because I believe fundamentally that will help us scale the project so that we can actually have more effective contributors, writing code.
Yeah, that's a good way of thinking about it. It'd be useful to measure those things and see whether whatever we do if the ultimate goal is to increase the volume and quality of functionality, I won't call it code because otherwise people start counting lines of it. But the technical value of Kubernetes, then I guess we should measure. We should come up with some way of measuring what it is and whether that trajectory goes up or down as a result of process. I think we've alluded to the fact that adding process can sometimes take us backwards rather than forwards, and we're consciously cautious of that. But we should probably try and figure out a way to measure whether we're heading in the right direction or not.
Yeah.
So a big thing outside of this too is making sure a simple way to gauge this, I think, is time to review and average time for PRs to find a home or to be resolved, merged or resolved or closed. Because right now we have the PR count over the last 6 months has gone from, I think it was 700 pending to over 1,000 pending. And the approvers, the people who can actually get the code into the repository, that count has not increased over time. Like the project number of PRs has scaled super linearly, and the approvers has been sublinear at best, right? So having a group of people who can review and help approve the process and to make it more smooth, I think would greatly benefit the project as it starts to scale. Well, we've already reached the breaking point. We're past the breaking point now.
Yeah.
I mean, one other thing that I'd like to put on there, and I've seen this anecdotally, people being frustrated. I'm going to say angry, but like frustrated in terms of like, hey, I wrote a PR. How can I get it reviewed? How can I get it in there? You have to work at a big company and know somebody to be able to get anything done in Kubernetes, right? And the truth of it is like, that's kind of true, right? I mean, it's like getting a PR reviewed oftentimes means that you have to build human connections. You have to build those relationships. And I don't think our structure is conducive to helping people build the relationships so they can work effectively. And so I think that's one of the things that we need to do here.
Yes.
I think that's a kind of a, I don't want to drag us on. If everyone wants to leave, we can call it a day now. But I think there's also a self-balancing aspect there. If a PR that is not interesting to the SIG arrives and it's badly written, chances are no one's going to get excited about reviewing it and merging it. If a super important PR arrives and it's well put together, I think it's much more likely to get enthusiastic reviewers getting it merged. So I think to some extent the symptom of not getting stuff reviewed and merged may be as much a symptom of lots of bad, or let's put it this way, unimportant and or low quality PR submitted, as it is sheer lack of reviewers. We have tons of reviewers. They just focus on what they think to be the most important thing for their given their available time.
I think there's this weird self-selecting priority, right? And I think that's the problem. As Joe alluded to, like a company X will care a lot about PRY, and they will spend time and energy reviewing that PR because it matters to them. And they will spend less time reviewing a PR that they might consider unimportant. So the idea of self-selection priority, I think, is a problem. So as a community, having at least a unified process or some way of like, you have a queue and you burn through your queue, right? Like right now, I got my queue to 0 yesterday and I was like, yay. but
Sisyphus, man, Sisyphus.
It's exactly like that.
In reality, it's a priority queue. I mean, it's not a FIFO queue. It's a priority queue.
But that's the thing, is like, who assigns the priority? Because right now, some of the elements, there's a lot of nepotism driven PR quid pro quo. And I think we need to have a way of, having a priority queue, which also has priority inversion. Just because a person submits a PR and we might consider it unimportant doesn't mean that we shouldn't give it review cycles, right? It should have some level of priority inversion after a period of time.
And I think, fundamentally, this is a people problem, and it is going to be. I mean, that priority queue will always be influenced by relationships. The one issue that I'm thinking about is somebody submitted a change to add a dependency to the Hypercube container image. Okay, so number one, Hypercube itself is kind of a redheaded stepchild that nobody claims ownership with. The packaging and testing of the Hypercube container image is yet another level of sort of like no concrete ownership. And this person was relying on that. And and didn't know who to talk to actually sort of, figure out, like, is this a good idea? What do I do? So they submit a PR, and it kind of drops into the void, and nobody's claiming ownership of that thing. And so I think a big part of this also is, again, this, in my mind, this comes down to creating clean lines of ownership, so that when somebody says, hey, I want to change XYZ, these are the people that I need to talk to do that. Will help create community, create relationships, and guide people from creating crappy PRs that nobody wants to look at, which I'm not saying that this was the case here, to creating PRs that are guided by best practices and experience, and it brings them into the community so that maybe they can actually start contributing more and become more and more additive. So yeah, that's what I was thinking about when I was saying that.
Cool. This is fantastic discussion, folks. Thank you so much. I'm going to go ahead and wrap it so we don't get too far afield here, but I sincerely appreciate everybody's time, and have a great rest of your day, and I'll see you in a week or sooner.
All right. Thanks, Jace. Have a good one, man.
Okay. Thanks.